How's it going, American history students? This is Mr. Bell coming back at you with another video lesson. Today we're going to be covering Unit 6 as we get toward the end. This is going to deal with sectionalism, so the pride in a state or region over your country, and the immediate causes of the American Civil War, including the election of President Lincoln. Now, this video may not be as high quality as previous notes presentations on YouTube. My mic is a little on the fritz, so I'm having to use the computer mic. You may notice if you've watched these videos in the past, I'm kind of at a different location. I'm sitting at my main desk here. So hopefully, though, this will serve the purpose of getting the information to you beyond just looking at the PowerPoint, which is available on Canvas. So thank you so much for tuning in, and let's get started. So we mentioned this before about how you have a perfect storm. You have the Industrial Revolution in France and England, the first Industrial Revolution in the North. Most of these are textile mills which are making clothing. The clothing is primarily made out of cotton. At this time you have the cotton gin invented, which presses the seeds out of the cotton. Why in the short term this may look to make things better for slaves, it increases the number of slaves who can be picking cotton, and it is going to increase the money that plantation owners are making, thus resulting in them buying more slaves. So you have this perfect storm. As this happens, you have an awakening in many parts of the country because of the work of abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, the Grimke sisters, and a few that we're going to talk about here today, and the deaths of people like Denmark Vesey, that enough is enough and it's time for this god-awful institution of slavery to go. Of course, the South isn't going to be willing to let it go without a fight. So, Kansas-Nebraska Act. As these two states, Kansas and Nebraska, were determining whether or not they were going to be slave or free, they were deciding this because of the Compromise of 1850, that they would vote on these issues, much like you or I would vote for a governor's race or a presidential race. They were going to hold a vote, a special election, and it was one simple question for the new citizens and future citizens of the state of Kansas and Nebraska. Do you want to be slave or free? Now, it's important to note that both these states would eventually end up choosing freedom, which is different from a lot of the other states who were given the option to vote, some of which went from free to slave, such as Delaware. Now, free soilers were people who lived in Kansas and Nebraska, and they wanted it to stay a free territory. In this political cartoon, you see that they feel like they are having slavery forced down their throat. It's being campaigned on. It's being pushed with an economic message, and they feel backed into a corner. Now, both these, not without some bloodshed, are going to choose freedom. So here you kind of see the state of things as far as the territories, the slave states, the free states at the time of the Kansas-Nebraska Act vote. What ends up happening is an event called Bleeding Kansas. I'm going to skip around a little bit here. You had two primary groups that descended into Kansas. You had border ruffians who were from miserable Missouri, which was one of the harshest slave states, who basically impersonated Kansas citizens, essentially what would be voter fraud, and they were heading to Kansas to vote for slavery in a state that they didn't even live in. In addition to this, you had abolitionists led by John Brown, one of the most extreme abolitionists that you will talk about in this class, along with his many sons, heading into Kansas to vote against slavery, and to also make sure, more importantly, that there was going to be a free and fair vote, and not to let the border ruffians kind of intimidate voters into voting for slavery. The result here is Bleeding Kansas. It is a prequel to the American Civil War. It's about 8 years before the American Civil War. You're going to have nearly 1,000 die, which is nothing compared to the 650,000 that will die in the Civil War, but still 1,000 deaths is 1,000 deaths. And you have a mini civil war in Kansas between the border ruffians and abolitionists led by John Brown. Now, in this conflict, the abolitionists end up getting the better of the pro-slavery folks because, again, both Kansas and Nebraska will choose freedom. Let's talk a little bit about what John Brown did at Bleeding, Kansas as the Kansas and Nebraska Act vote was getting ready to take place and some other things leading up to the Civil War. So he traveled there with his 5 sons, who were all part of his abolitionist cause. He thought that God had called him to help bring it in to slavery. He was viewed by some, like Abraham Lincoln, like Frederick Douglass, as a bit extreme for their taste, but he was by any means necessary to end slavery, including violence. So there's a famous story of he and his sons going in the night before the vote, renting some cabins near Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas, pretending to be border ruffians, people who were going to vote for slavery from Missouri, and ultimately, as those border ruffians fell asleep, he and his sons went into their cabin, killed them, chopped them up, threw them into Pottawatomie Creek, and you could see the blood run down the river. Another big event that it kind of culminates John Brown's abolitionist life is a raid on Harper's Ferry. His goal was to storm the Harper's Ferry Federal Arsenal, the biggest collection of guns near Washington, D.C., in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, with his sons, and they would be joined by slaves who were supposed to leave nearby plantations and other abolitionists, and they would arm themselves to fight back against their oppressors. Well, John Brown and his sons get into Harper's Ferry. They kill the guards there. They kill the military men there, and they're able to get a ton of weapons. However, excuse me, I had to sneeze there. However, what winded up happening was the slaves from the nearby plantations didn't show up. So here you had John Brown and his 5 sons there, and they couldn't carry all these weapons out. So instead of being greeted by runaway slaves, they were greeted by the United States Marine Corps, led by Robert E. Lee, who would go on to be the general for the Confederacy, and he would stop John Brown at Harper's Ferry. John Brown, they kill a few of his sons. I don't think they kill all of them. John Brown's put on trial. He knows that death is inevitable here for the things that he has done. And when he's put on trial, he uses his nationally publicized, the biggest news story in the country, one of the biggest news stories in the world at the time, his trial, to not defend himself, because he essentially knows he's a dead man with the death penalty, but rather to fight against and speak against the institution of slavery and defend the rights of African Americans in the United States, especially those who are being kept in the bondage of slavery. So you see, this debate is going from a debate to violent action on both sides. It's not just abolitionists and border ruffians. You have this in Congress. Preston Brooks is a senator from South Carolina, and Charles Sumner, Massachusetts. They're debating the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Sumner has the floor. Preston Brooks doesn't like what he says because he believes that taking slavery away from the South will kill, especially his state's economy. He walks down to the bottom of the Senate floor, and he beats him with a cane. So this catches a lot of national attention. The biggest rival for Abraham Lincoln headed into the 1860 presidential election is a guy named Stephen Douglas, who is also from Illinois. Now, his name's Little Giant because he's 5'4" compared to Lincoln's 6'4". Even though he's a little man, he's a political giant. He'll have a great series of debates between he and Lincoln that we're going to talk about here in a second. So he believes that the states should decide slavery, no matter what. No matter what the Supreme Court ends up saying, no matter who wins the 1860 presidential election, his desire is always to allow the states to decide. The Dred Scott case. This is one of the worst rulings in the history of the United States Supreme Court. Is seen as one of the last big setbacks for the abolitionist movement before slavery ends. There's a lot of ins and outs to the story of Dred Scott, which in a normal class I would go through. However, for the sake of these video notes, I'm just going to go through the ruling here. Connie rules slaves are not citizens. Instead, slaves are property. and the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. In other words, the 3630 line should not limit slavery. So this is a huge hit because then it allows free states in the North to hold popular sovereignty votes whether or not they want to be slave or free. And this is where you see states like Delaware choosing slavery, which is a northern state. Now, while this is on one end a huge setback for anti-slavery abolitionists, it is also a big moment because a congressman from Illinois in the House uses this as a chance to step up on the national stage and be the first person really since David Wilmot to publicly condemn slavery and how this case is, the ruling that Taney made in this case is flat out wrong. Slaves are people, they're not property. And this person is Lincoln. So Taney says they're property, Lincoln argues they're people. We are off to the political races here because this is going to jumpstart, catapult, however you want to say it, Abraham Lincoln's bid toward the presidency in 1860. So, kind of like in the mid-early 1800s, so the 1820s, 30s, 40s, you had a perfect storm to increase the number of slaves, such as the Cotton Gin Industrial Revolution. At this time, you're seeing the perfect storm to combat slavery. A big piece of this is Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's a book written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. She is someone who grew up in the North, Harriet Beecher Stowe, went to visit some cousins in the South, saw how slaves were treated, and decided she was going to write a fictional book about it. In the book, you see the character of Uncle Tom, who's a very likable slave, go from a polite slave-owning family to a very good slave-owning family to the worst of the worst in Simon Legree. And what it did was it gave a human face, even though it's a fictional character. It's a very likable and relatable character, religious character in Tom, that people could relate to in the North. And seeing the hardships of this character was eye-opening because it made a lot of people realize slaves were going through this in real life, despite this being a work of fiction. She gains fame when Abraham Lincoln invites her to the White House for a dinner, and his famous quote toward Harriet Beecher Stowe is, "So you're the little lady that started this big war." Now, this is one of the big things that leads toward the American Civil War. 6.2, this is a shorter section compared to the Civil War coming up, so we're just going to go through these and be done with Unit 6 video notes here. So this talks about the causes of the Civil War. You hear people say that the cause of the Civil War is states' rights. While technically that is true, it is the states' rights to have slavery that causes the Civil War. So it is states' rights, but it's also slavery. Those two go hand in hand, like a glove and a hand. You can't kind of separate those things historically. The South viewed it as, hey, our states created this government, therefore we should be able to opt out, we should be able to nullify, and if we can't, we should be able to secede. Because if you take slavery away from the South, their economy is going to collapse. Now, secede means to leave a country, which is what the 11 southern states will do to conform the Confederacy. So, just before we get into Lincoln's presidential bid, I mentioned he was in the House. He runs for a Senate seat in 1858 against Stephen Douglas. They have 7 debates, most of which have to do with slavery. Lincoln wins 4 of these debates. However, he loses the Senate seat, barely in Illinois, to Stephen Douglas. However, he will go on to beat Stephen Douglas in the presidential race, who he runs against him and some other candidates in 1860. So, Lincoln gets elected president in 1860. He doesn't get any votes from southern states. South Carolina says that they do not trust Abraham Lincoln, who when he is running for president and initially after he becomes president, he says his main goal is to preserve the Union. He doesn't want to end slavery. He just wants to stop it from spreading. He's not an abolitionist, which technically he's not an abolitionist. However, if you studied Abraham Lincoln, you knew he may have said he just wants to stop it from spreading, but that's not what actions have said leading up to it. So the South kind of sees the writing on the wall that this guy is going to try to end slavery, which he does with the Emancipation Proclamation. and 13th Amendment. So they say, we're out, and South Carolina secedes from the Union. There you see the electoral map. You see that Lincoln carries the Northeast, and he carries the West Coast. Now, Lincoln is a Republican. At this time, the Republican were the more liberal party. They were the anti-slavery party, whereas the Democrats were the more conservative party. This flips in 1960, 100 years later, when Kennedy runs for president. Secession is when a state leaves. Overall, 11 states secede, the first being South Carolina. There's some debate whether or not North Carolina is the last. I think it's either, some people claim Tennessee may have been the last state to secede, but most people will tell you that South Carolina is the first state, North Carolina the last state. That timetable is disputed because there was a big process you had to go to secede from the Union, a vote at the state legislature level. Think about this, guys. 11 states leave. They say we're no longer part of the USA. Within the United States, they form their own confederacy, their own country, called the Confederate States of America, based on states' rights. Now, there are some slave states that don't secede. As you see here, Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, Maryland, which it makes sense for those latter two because they're more northern states who adopted slavery late after the Compromise of 1850. Lincoln's primary objective is to stop Maryland from seceding once the Civil War starts, because Virginia, the home of Robert E. Lee, secedes. It becomes the headquarters of the Confederacy. Richmond, Virginia is to the Confederacy what Washington, D.C. is to the Union. Well, D.C. is tucked in between Virginia and Maryland, so Lincoln knows if Maryland secedes, then D.C. will be surrounded. So he uses for the first time what's called martial law. Now, it had been used before by George Washington in the Whiskey Rebellion, but this is where you first hear the term martial law, which is using the military to force your citizens to do something, to police your citizens. He has the military take over a United States state in Maryland, prevent them from leaving their homes, and holding a vote to secede. Now, seen as extreme, but it does ultimately end up working out in his favor because Maryland's not allowed to secede. This all culminates the April after Lincoln is sworn in, that March, in the attack on Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter is off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. Now, Fort Sumter had been a U.S. fort. However, the Confederacy had taken it over. They were starving out the Union soldiers in there and said, this is now our fort. And they were kind of daring Lincoln to do something about it. So Lincoln faced a big debate internally in his administration and he himself. What should I do? I got two options. I can let the fort go. That makes me look weak, makes me look like I'm accepting the Confederacy as a legitimate thing. Or I can go and defend the fort, or at the very least send food to the fort, and that risks starting a civil war, especially if you defend the fort. So he goes with kind of an in-between. He doesn't attack the fort. Now he sends naval ships in case the food's not allowed to be delivered because these soldiers are starving. When he doesn't just surrender the fort to the CSA, he brings food, he sends food to the troops at Fort Sumter. He kind of puts the ball in the court of the Confederacy. If you want to shoot down this supply ship feeding starving soldiers and be the aggressor, be my guest. They take the bait, they fire, the Civil War has started. There you see a different view of Fort Sumter. So, Unit 7 will focus on Civil War and Reconstruction. There's a little half unit at the end, but Unit 7 is the last big unit of the course, so we'll be on that for a while. I'll probably break that into at least 2, maybe 3 videos. If you have any questions, please email me at bsbell@clevelandcountyschools.org. Thank you so much for all your hard work. Please be safe. Please wash your hands. Wear a mask. Social distance when you can. Thank you so much.